Hey everybody, it's Cole with BleepinJeep. Today we're going to get a set of Yukon lockouts. I'll show you how to install them, and then we'll go give them a test. So stay tuned. So here's how the Dana 60 lockouts show up. Let's open up the box and check it out. These come packaged up pretty nice. Let's pull them apart and see what they look like. So here's a quick breakdown of what's in one Yukon lockout hub. In here you have a spring retainer, a coil spring, or also known as a lockout spring, a spacer ring, a coupler and driver, snap rings for the axle and the hub, a cam spacer and retainer plate, an O-ring for the selector and the bezel, nylon washers, and your bezel bolts. Make sure to take note when you're ordering your Yukon lockout hub for a Dana 60, whether it came off a Ford, Chevy, or Dodge, because I believe that spacer ring is a different length depending on which hub you have. The tools for this job are pretty basic. All you need is a 5/32 Allen or a 5/32 Allen with an inch-pound torque wrench, a couple picks, and some crimson or other water shedding grease. Something you don't have to do, but I like to do, is to jack up the axle. It makes it a lot easier when you're trying to line up the coupler and driver. So here's the empty hub of where we want to start. It's all the way down to the spindle nut, and I'll zoom in on that in a minute once we get the spring retainer in. So this is the spring retainer. It has a beveled side and a flat side. You want to make sure that the beveled side is towards the inside of the axle and the flat side is on the outside. The instructions don't show it that well. So here's a shot of the inside of the hub with just the spindle nuts and the spring retainer in, and you can see how clean all the teeth are for the axle and the hub. You want to make sure everything's cleaned up and get them greased up real good. The next thing you want to do is take some grease and go ahead and grease the inside of those hub splines and the axle splines. Don't be afraid to be extra thorough with that. Now we want to go ahead and install the coil spring or lockout spring. Then you have your spacer ring. Go ahead and lube that up because you don't ever want it to get locked up on your axle shaft. Install it inside the spring, and it sits right up against the nut, the spindle nut. Next, you have your coupler and driver. I actually had my selector on there too. You want to go ahead and grease it up real well. This is another one of those items that you want to grease up thoroughly. Take it apart, grease every piece. I thought I could save some time by installing it all as one unit. As you can see here, once I got it on there and tried to get it on the axle shaft and inside the hub, even with turning the tire, I still had a problem doing it. So I ended up having to take it apart and doing the driver and coupler separate. It made it a lot easier to get it inside the hub. Then I just had to hold it inside there. I went ahead and greased the brass bushing, got it cleaned up real well, and then installed it onto the axle shaft. So now that we have the coupler and driver in, we can install the axle side snap ring. It's just a matter of sliding the starting piece onto the notch of the axle and working your way around and just doing a little bit at a time. I ended up having to take my gloves off to do this because it's extremely hard to hold on to it and get that snap ring in there with your gloves slopping around your fingers. But once you have it on there, it usually snaps in pretty easily. Ta-da! Next thing you want to do is take the cam spacer and retainer plate and the retainer plate can go either way. You slide the cam spacer into it, just like that, and then you set it inside the hub. Once you have it set inside the hub, you can go ahead and grab your hub side snap ring. It separates just like the axle side snap ring, except it goes into the groove of the hub. Now I will have to admit that Yukon spring is pretty darn stiff. So it takes a lot of pressure to get that snap ring up into that lockout, or into that notch. But once you get it worked into the notch, you just continue to work it around the same way as you do on the axle. Once you have it in, then you can go ahead and grab your selector. If it doesn't have the O-ring on it already, go ahead and put the O-ring on it. Then take some of your grease, and I like to grease that O-ring. The reason I like to grease that O-ring is I don't want any water to get in there. Then you grab the bezel, snap it into place, and it fits right in. Work it over to the lock side. Then I like to take a little more grease, and I like to grease the outer O-ring. I know some guys use RTV and some guys use nothing. I like to use that water resilient grease because it keeps the water out of the hub. Then I take one bolt with the nylock washer and I go to line it up. Now one thing you need to remember that I messed up right there on is you want to have the notch of the cam spacer on the low side notch right there of the selector. Next thing you want to do is grab your 5/32 Allen and go ahead and install all 6 of your bolts and nylon washers. One thing that the instructions call for is to go ahead and put a little Loctite on each one of your bolts. I personally believe that's only something you need to do if you have an issue with them backing out. In my case, I went ahead and did it, and I just hope they'll come out when I need them to. After that, I like to go ahead and function it a couple times just to make sure everything's free and moves smoothly. Once I know I can do that, then you're supposed to take your torque wrench and torque it to 22 inch-pounds. Now let's go take this thing for a rip.
One and done, son. You can straighten your rear up.
That's it.